Representation is talked about so often now with film and media discourse that it's as though it's the most important thing about artistic products and always has been, less so things like craft and poetic finesse. Some seem to view media artifacts purely through the lens of what races or genders are shown in the text and how they were represented. Indeed, this is something written about in most critical theory or media studies texts and textbooks. Representation is presupposed as one of the macro elements of media, with things like mise-en-scène, editing, and sound being the micro elements, relegated as mere mouthpieces compared to the race, sex, or sexuality of the characters depicted. This is an example of something rooted in critical theory that has disseminated into common parlance discussions and naturalized as a legitimate talking point, similar in vein to intersectionality. One doesn't have to have read Kimberly Crenshaw to know what that is and drop its phraseology upon hapless parents to get the moral jump on them in the increasingly charged and intergroup discussions about cultural artifacts. Critical theory can and has certainly grown into an unkempt form of petulant iconoclasm and unproductive moral gesticulation. I don't believe it to be as deep as it may sound, and its applied postmodernity is something any college student can pick up on inadvertently. The postmodern condition befalls all of us. People, particularly young people, are prone to a collective Cartesian malaise where there are simply too many narratives to keep up with, too many unstable facts and ideals to feel grounding in the objective realm. By being full critical, plugging stimuli through a mode of criticality where everything is seen through the lens of power dynamics or oppression, you get to have something to say about everything in the canon without ever having to read the canon. It also launches you ahead moralistically without having to do any actual work. This is largely why critical theory and nihilistic postmodern navel-gazing is so frequent among college students and young people. The theories themselves aren't that deep, and purposefully or not, they are being reenacted by these young people who happen to be inclined towards their validity even without reading them. So when they hear words like intersectionality or representation as a concept, it's easy for them to feel immediately armed with life affirmation tools or feel a sense of being held morally hostage without the tools to argue against it. If you don't agree with the prescription, you're a bigot or deliberately obstructing egalitarianism. This isn't to say that all of critical theory or applied postmodernism is pointless. There's a lot here that actually is helpful if our goal is to construct a better future with aid of instrumental skepticism. The issue is that it tends to turn into an endless and unconstructive panhandling about the ills of the world, or, at worst, advocation for immoral deviance through the guise of some social revolution, or that morality is dubious as a concept in itself, be it violence being good, censorship being necessary, and intelligence being epistemic violence aimed to oppress the marginalized, a queering of the category for queering's sake. There's plenty of valid reason to devote portions of study and discussion to representation. Whether by accident or not, representation speaks to socio-economic dynamics, and this can enhance a bardic enjoyment of a text and give it new layers for thought. Night of the Living Dead's Ben, played by Black American Dwayne Jones, meeting a demise at the hands of the police rather than the film Zombies, analogized with the real world possibly without even intending to. This gave the text another dimension of meaning besides it being a horror film. I thought it was cool that Alien had a lead female protagonist in Ripley. We saw less representation in that department, certainly in action, and just for novelty's sake, it was cool to see. Besides the horror element being amplified by women being semiotically tagged with their obvious associations we need not get into, certainly back then. Growing up, it made me feel happy that, say, my sister had something like that to displace herself upon in the sea of male action stars, without an obvious figure to displace yourself upon, you may need to reach beyond your remit of perception. Bell Hooks has this theory known as oppositional gaze. She spoke about how, in her day, black people were depicted in fairly undignified ways, and she found herself incapable of coming out on top within the narrative without opposing the text and displacing herself upon the lead character, often a male or white figure. Since characters that she deemed bared her resemblance or identity stripped her of individual sovereignty, she had to oppose the text in order to feel like an individual at all. This is something I've related to. I did it for much of my adolescence without even knowing it. East Asians were fairly homogenous in the Hollywood films I watched growing up. They were rarely successful sexually or well-spoken in English, which I found utterly embarrassing. So I'd subconsciously looked for other everymen to experience the settings of the film through. So media certainly matters in conditioning one's sense of self. There's a lot of talk on whether we live in an increasingly technologically deterministic episteme, whether the hypodermic needle has returned with the pervasive influence media has now. On the eye test, you can certainly feel that knowledge is getting more shallow. Secondhand politics from TikTok think pieces and unsighted Instagram infographics. But then you hear about things like how Japan's population self-reported on feeling depressed far less when commercials still referred to general malaise as sadness rather than depression. When they started referencing the more technical sounding depression, more people were willingly getting treated for depression. Depression's dissemination in language from media reified it as a concept, spoken into existence, if you will. An alarming amount of American politicians were in favor of bombing Agrabah, the fictional city in Aladdin. So it seems talk of a hypodermic needle isn't just a pessimistic outlook anymore. We're increasingly reliant on media. Children are going outside less, seeing their friends far less than they did, and hang out on their devices far more than ever. This means what's being shown on screen has absolute importance, probably more than ever. However, the obsessiveness with representation, teaching people to look at media purely through that lens, is unequivocally an impediment to encouraging actual critical thinking skills. We risk losing the ability to extrapolate use from our art unless the centerpiece looks like us. I think thinking like that is just incredibly hollow and materialistic. Obviously, we want enough of a balance of the population being represented to avoid exclusion and stereotyping where possible. But great art has never been made purely for such a purpose, nor does an artist have any mandate to create their art for that purpose. Representation for diversity's sake should be encouraged where possible, but lack thereof can and should be a design choice that we tolerate. One should be able to depict anyone in any way. The problem is when certain patterns repeat themselves without a referent in reality. Issues like that ought to be resolved through open discussion and continued understanding of what different cultures actually operate like, rather than things like censorship and changing the meaning of art into something purely surface level and sterile. Art has a right to offend, and you have a right to say it's of the lower order sort, if you wish. And we also have to remember that because people are different, we can't even assume every depiction to be a stereotype just because it fits a type at all. For the naive egalitarians who think that equality can only be achieved if every domain or sector is populated with equal parts of every conceivable kind of person, the gender equality paradox is an incredible inconvenience. Men and women making different career choices in the more equal societies is an irritation for those who buy into social constructionism. So the argument succeeding has to be that girls are raised suboptimally, perhaps that PE classes where they're told they throw well for a girl is the reason why they tend not to do as well at shot put as the boys, and that the media landscape and linguistic environment they're raised in is generally one that isn't conducive to encouraging diverse career paths. Perhaps some fields still aren't so welcoming to women or their subliminally brainwashed into thinking they're incapable of competing in them. Even if these assumptions are entertained and representation is not inappropriately deemed an outlet for equalizing the inequalities in socialization, representation alone won't make your art sufficiently powerful to get the message across. Of late, we're seeing a growing apathy towards films starring members of marginalized groups that are simperingly hollow. It's less so art than it is agitprop, as if the mere shell, its represented elements, that which is orated relentlessly on the press tour and marketing, is not enough for any piece to be added to the canon of great works. Who could have thunk it? Aliens happened to be a great movie besides its lead happening to be a woman. Lady Ghostbusters is atrocious, and not because it starred women. One should be allowed to think so without being called a sexist. And a lot of women aren't so surface level as to accept whatever is served up just because it bears their resemblance. Also, take aside the fact that a lot of media isn't encoded with obvious or comforting self-inserts. Lolita was told from the point of view of a hebephile, Taxi Driver from a cabbie that goes on a murder spree, and even UK Office being centered on a cringe-bag narcissist boss, desperately vying for adoration. A lot of narratives aren't built to have you look up to its characters, but rather to encourage introspection and recognition of your own shadow. To assume every text is encoded as some theme park attraction, and so is compelled to being a custodian for whoever is watching anyways, is totally philistinic. Again, that's not what art is exclusively. That's why representation, largely, has never been macro. There are deeper ideas about the general human condition that every text speaks to. That's how people have been able to oppose text representation at all previously. Something else grabbed them. You don't have to be white or English to have Romeo and Juliet's doomed romance grab hold of you. You don't have to be a man to identify with Luke Skywalker's hero mythology, a rescuing of the father from the darkness that lies dormant within all of us. Under the guise of making media more inclusive, we've at times battered even higher virtues that tied human beings together irrespective of their appearance and biology, precisely the deeper macro truisms like the hero myth, love, family, altruism, or humility even. Obviously, art has no imperative to act as moral instruction for its consumers, and an inversion of that which is sacred can imply the beautiful through its absence. But by the critical theorist's own technologically deterministic outlook, an overabundance of this kind of anti-text risks turning the masses off from the marginalized groups further, and has already in many ways. Every other film that has anything but the typical hegemonic cast in it now is deemed woke, and it's become hard to just talk about films like we used to. I have a suspicion that if Alien came out today, people would call even that woke, based on how inflamed the discursive environment has become. And silly as that mindset may be, it's understandable when you have wave after wave of patronizing rhetoric holding the masses morally hostage if they didn't like Ghostbusters or new Star Wars for fairly legitimate reasons besides representation. If there are people who are stupid for waving off films for its non-hegemonic leads, people are also stupid for thinking that that's what ultimately matters when they make their art or engage in criticism. The dislodging of bardic storytelling does more damage to social cohesion than mere representation, because we've seen how the masses took to diversity previously, before the cultural slide towards post-structuralism and the battering of the monomyth. The monomyth does not need changing, it only needs new faces and inclusion. Mulan was a great example of a woman donning the same hat. Despite obvious falters, she voluntarily confronts her destiny and works through her foibles, that which we all have. The remake of Mulan, however, has its lead will her desires into existence through sheer script convenience, allowing her unassailable invincibility, that which none of us are. This is the kind of patronizing representation that turns people off from any notion of inclusivity, as if women don't bruise from struggle on occasion. You see this in fine art with its movement away from realism and beauty, just as more members of marginalised communities have their foot in the door. When you walk into Manchester Art Gallery and see that all of the beautiful paintings are by the so-called hegemonic groups, whilst the people of colour and women are limited to the contemporary section's swirl of abstract trash, it sends all of the wrong messages. Some feminist scholars justify this by reducing even the monomyth to a sexist construction, even beauty to mere white supremacist Eurocentric norm. In academia, and trickle out into common parlance, there's a constant pairing of anything good traditionally with that which is closer to the father, the authoritarian, or fascist, inadvertently tying the marginalized with the irrational and outsider binary. It's a totally self-defeating form of rebranded essentialism. There are Marxist scholars who take even Barbie's choice to becoming human at the end of the film to being too Christian and apologetic to capitalism. But previous iterations of texts that demonstrated once excluded identities manifesting the same outcomes gets ignored in spite of their success as cultural artifacts. Captain Marvel was audaciously pitched as being one of the first female action stars because some sausage fingers behind the desk thought it'd sell better with that narrative. The artifacts of yesteryear succeeded because they embodied values that are higher than representation in narrative. Now, I am by no means saying there's a significant cinematic slide towards unbridled nihilism and egoistic hedonism driven by postmodern neo-Marxist fuckery with art and culture, though language games, deliberate mythologizing, and conceptual reification certainly occurs from the hands of some bad actors at least. One can only avoid being misled about reality if they are media literate and can see past how things are merely represented. This is of crucial importance so to not abstract out a wrong way of being. Bella from Twilight is positioned as some everyman character for the viewer to project themselves upon, so to experience the world created in a similar vein as Harry Potter in Hogwarts. However, if you actually break down what she does throughout the text, she's actually incredibly selfish, and somehow endowed with everyone's love, whilst being dull as dishwater and doing zilch to earn any attention. The last thing young girls in the audience need is to have her presented as normal, when she's anything but. Ramona Flowers in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off ends the narrative choosing herself, as if she hadn't just spent the entirety of the series choosing herself over everyone else, entertaining her whims constantly and never demonstrating any loyalty or flexibility for anyone else. Ladybird is another example of a character that, if you didn't just swallow the text centering of her narrative lying down, is such a pompously egoistic black hole that everyone around her has to appease. She dicks her mum around and still has the audacity to ask her to both like and love her at the same time. She largely escapes criticism for treating her like shit and gets away scot-free at the end, having her cake and eating it too. This kind of rampant self-actualizing isn't a lesson that anyone needs, especially with the target audience of Americans who are already soap operatic lovies caught in their own feelings.
I've been through a lot in the last 4 years.
You see the same mythologizing in Reddit Am I the Asshole posts, where asshole behaviors are intellectualized and criticisms of asshole behaviors get downvoted by people who want to stay in the nursery. Jean Twenge spoke of the narcissism epidemic in 2010, pre-internet ubiquity. So you can see how these trends emerged. Perhaps more than ever then, we need to look past mere representation when the core content of texts is this grotesque. It's like when people yas-queened Kim Jong-un's sister potentially stepping in as supreme leader when he got ill, just to have a bit of female leadership. Or when we hate billionaires but Taylor Swift and Selena Gomez are slayage and totally fine because they're sisters. And there's also no fixed monolith of what art should look like all of the time. It'd be pretty boring if there wasn't trite art to moan about and compare great art against as a lesson for what not to do as an artist. Aesthetically inverting the beautiful, drawing attention to its absence, can firmly imply the beautiful too, and as much as we're seeing postmodern iconoclasm, we're also seeing a metamodern shift towards sincerity from the rubble of the broken pieces of culture. Everything Everywhere All at Once is effectively a hyper-distilled version of the hero myth that advocates for a social conservatism, being pro-family and love, using postmodern and absurdist form to uncover such values, powerfully demonstrating that it survives all assaults. Wonder Woman was a great example of a classical hero taking the form of a woman, some pundits arguing that it needed to be set in an archaic time for this to still be accepted at all extra-textually. There's a beautiful line at the end of Isabel by George Saunders, where amidst the swirl of chaos and ills in the world, the unnamed narrator persists with looking after the disabled daughter of a flawed man. It's not perfect, he muses. Sometimes it's damn hard, but I look after her and she squeals with delight when I come home, and the sum total of sadness in the world is less than it would have been. Here you see the rescuing of the father, in what Jonathan Pageau would call the rediscovery of the sacred, without the iconography of old, something we should make room for as a kind of necessary semiotic intermediary, the necessary shadow painting between Plato's sun and cave for those who can't see in the extreme dark or light. So in the absence of being able to control for our aesthetics being fixed in meaning, we can at least control our own reception to art. It's really the only thing we can control. We're never going to represent every single kind of person possible on the infinite spectrum of the intersectional framework. From one epoch to the next, someone's going to feel left out. But we can at least control our participation in the meaning making of a text. This means we have to be able to see past how characters look and use our empathy when consuming text. It also happens to be the crucial ability that needs to be honed if we are going to coexist as a mass of increasingly multicultural cohorts. Representation matters, but it isn't as macro as other things that truly tie us together. On an individual level, you shouldn't need to see exactly yourself to be able to extrapolate what is important bardically. Without the ability to take offense in general, let alone in our art, the world we want to live in stands less of a chance of existing. Having the lateral thinking ability means the text ultimately doesn't matter as much as your ability to make use of it. It's knowing how to abstract from elliptical texts that lack, say, beauty, from knowing what beauty is, and therefore knowing how to act. We need the lateral thinking skills to see the beauty implied. To see goodness, we must have goodness. It safeguards against however the media landscape is looking like. Like learning what not to do from seeing that one family relative that does all of the wrong things. I don't need to be black to empathize with Chris in Get Out, because I can look beyond epidermal features. It's okay to foreground those worldly elements for an invective or moral theme from time to time, but it's not all there is to art, nor should it be. We have plenty of great art out there already. We can always make the next thing better and more inclusive, but we should also be strong enough to not need everything our way to be textually gratified. With the right mindset, you can get something out of any text. Whilst we shouldn't have to oppose a text, you should at least be able to, and only a true individual can do that.